All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very happy to have you guys here. We're going to go ahead and get started right on time. And first, welcome, as we said. And I'm going to start with just introducing who the speakers are going to be today. So we have with us, we have Dr. Stu Haywood, the Director of the HR Practice and the Head People Officer at Business Sherpa Group. And then we also have Zach Fleming, Director, Managed Recruitment at Business Sherpa Group. And myself, I am Leanne Bell. I am the Marketing Manager here at Business Sherpa Group. And together we're going to provide an interactive panel discussion all about representation in recruitment in partnership with the Welch EDI Community Alliance. So welcome, as we said. Just a couple quick housekeeping things. So everyone knows the main chat function is disabled for the webinar today. However, instead we ask you to use the Q&A function to submit questions for the panelists. Panelists are going to be able to see the questions and we can mark them as answered once they've been addressed. So we'll try our best not to miss anything. And pop your questions into the Q&A as they come up. We will either answer them in the moment or we'll come back to them at the very end. Just so everybody knows, the session is being recorded and Welch will be sending out a recording after the event is done. So with that, very quick synopsis. What I'd like to start off with is just hearing a bit about the panelists' background and what kind of brings them here to the table today in terms of representation in recruitment. So Stu, if you want to explain a bit about your background, that'd be great.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Stu Haywood, and I think there's a lot of things that I find make me very passionate about EDII initiatives. So first and foremost, I think, as an HR professional, we're always trying to look at how can we make business more effective? And, unless we're including and getting the best out of all the people that are working with us, we're not being as effective as we can be. So I think obviously there's a lot of great social reasons for diversity and inclusion initiatives, but there's also great business initiatives and rationales for it. So, and personally, I sort of came to that exposure early in life. When I first finished my undergraduate degree, I actually joined the military, and I was one of the first women to serve in ships in the Navy, and just living the experience of the Canadian Armed Forces trying to open up roles to women. It's not just enough to say, hey, it's okay now, we're going to allow women to join. All of the other both big picture and little picture issues that get into the way and that really become barriers for people, and how important it is to think through these initiatives, to identify those barriers and to remove them, and to always be ready to remove them for all the ones that you might have missed. It's not a one-time exercise. And I think that's what really made me passionate about this, and where I've continued to work in this area for many, many years since.
All right, thank you. And then Zach, let's hear a little bit about your background and what brings you here today.
Sure. Thanks, Leanne. Hey, everybody. So I've been with BSG for a long time, always on the recruitment side for the most part, and for the past few years leading the practice. So from our view in recruitment, really have a sort of a front row seat on sort of what's going on, what decisions employers are making, the way they're thinking about hiring, and increasingly, fortunately and happily, we're seeing more and more employers focused on EDI initiatives, incorporating EDI principles into their hiring. So I've been able to see that evolution over the years. There's new tools that come out that are meant to increase the effectiveness of EDI hiring, and more importantly, seeing employers, as Sue says, kind of embrace that more and more, understanding the value of having a diverse workforce, and incorporating EDI principles into their hiring practices. So that's been my experience, having a front row seat into what's going on, and that's what brings me here.
Well, welcome to you both. Thank you for sharing your expertise today. I'd also love to know a little bit about who is attending. And so we have a poll that we're going to launch, an anonymous poll, and there it should pop up on your screen now. So if you just want to click what best fits your role in your organization's hiring processes, that would be a great start so we can get to know who's here. And we'll just give you guys a few seconds to submit your responses, and then we will go through those results. All right, so you should be able to see the results. So we have 17% folks related to HR, 0% related to being the hiring manager role, 29% as the recruiter, 14% senior leadership, 3% of job seekers, and 37% are other. So that's interesting demographic. From your interactions with those who are interested in embracing EDI or implementing EDI in the recruitment or in the workplace, do you, Sue or Zach, do you see those metrics reflected? Is there anything that stands out?
I think the only thing that I would highlight is, sometimes we make the error in our thinking of that, unless I am in charge of recruitment, this isn't my concern. And EDI initiatives actually need to involve every single person in the company. Every single person in an organization is accountable for the culture, and forming that culture and making the environment as inclusive as possible. Obviously, we have different roles that we play and we have different levels of accountability, but it's not a responsibility that we can just slough off and say, well, I don't do recruiting, so therefore I don't need to be inclusive. So, it's important to understand who the demographic is, but it's also not something we can use as an excuse.
I'll jump in here. I really like seeing all those recruiters in the audience, and HR people too. And I know some of those are my team. Thanks for joining there, gang. But I'll say that, related to what Sue's saying, a bunch of those people who call themselves none of the above, certainly those senior leaders, will be or have been hiring managers at some point. So somehow we got 0 hiring managers in the poll, or a low number, but I think everybody, or many people, will play that role at some point and do frequently. And so that's a great lens to kind of listen to the discussion through, or view the discussion through.
Yeah, very true. Okay, so now we have a second quick poll, just to learn a little bit more. We're going to launch that. So where is the diversity in your organization right now? So how would you describe your organization's diversity hiring practices? Very good, good. Okay, we need some work. Maybe you don't have any, or that you don't know of. So I'll just go through that. Take a few seconds. All right, now we should see the results. All right, so this looks good to me. Zach, how does this reflect what your experience does?
Well, I think it's great. I mean, I think, when I think of the typical employer, or sort of the mass of employers out there, it's unlikely we'd see, if people are answering honestly, a distribution like this. But it looks like we've got a great audience here who could probably, at some point in the discussion, teach us some things. So that's really good to see. Probably doesn't reflect the broader pool of employers, and that makes sense, right? Who's going to attend a webinar like this? It's going to be people who are keen on it. So makes sense to me, and it looks like a great audience.
Agree. All right. So with that, Sue, I would love to learn a little bit about what EDI looks like in your field, so in HR.
So I guess from an HR only perspective, one of the big roles of HR professionals is to, maximize the people capability, the talent capability in an organization. And, without, equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigeneity activities, we can't do that for the entire population. And so if we, sort of step back and think about people as machines, and I'm not about to suggest they are, but if we were a manufacturing firm, we would never say, hey, our production line works really, really well, but 25% of our equipment isn't working. Right. You would never say those two things. But in a sense, without this, HR professionals have been leading the charge, and that without recognizing that we're not allowing, 25, 40%, 50%, 60% of our workforce to, be who they are and bring their true expertise to the workplace, or we're missing that talent. Even worse, we're not even bringing that talent into the workplace. It kind of is like trying to say that your production line's working, even though, half your machinery is down. So it's really about how do we tap into people to get the best. And one of the best ways to do that is a people first approach to HR and people management, and really focusing on how do we make people feel included and valued and respected in the workplace, so that they come to work with their best work, their best ideas, their best thoughts, and don't have to waste time on, coming around the barriers that have been systemically put in place for them. So really just about creating that wonderful environment to breed success.
Yeah. And Zach, when we look at specifically the recruitment field, what does EDI currently look like there with you and what you're working in?
Well, I'd say it's all over the place. So, there are many employers that are, as we've said, are recognizing the increasing significance of EDI and trying to build a diverse workforce or talent base. And so they're at kind of the leading edge of things, adopting EDI principles, recruitment. And otherwise, it goes down the gamut, right? There are other organizations that are, yeah, it's a thing they might care about, but they don't find that they have the time or the expertise to really go hard at it. And then there are others that just perhaps aren't paying attention, and it's just not on their radar, these kind of initiatives or this kind of thinking. So, that's kind of what we see. And as recruiters, we're in a good spot here. Of course, what we do is execute on a recruitment program. So that's an important role to play. But in addition, we have the opportunity to influence decision makers and leaders and everyone to adopt or develop, implement really solid recruitment programs and processes, right, that can incorporate or are driven by EDI principles. So that's where it sits within recruitment. We're on the front lines, and we get to see a lot of different things, seeing sort of positive movement, especially in the past few years.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And so before we dive into some of those positive processes you just referenced there, are there any big challenges that you see or that you come across in the work you do in recruitment?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the challenges are, say, kind of ongoing or traditional. They've always been challenges, and that's just being really objective about, even before you get to recruitment, thinking about, and this is HR 101 type stuff, job design or job development, really understanding jobs well, being super objective about it, examining those jobs deeply and developing them really well, and then kind of using that base to develop a really strong program. So develop your sourcing activities based on the job, and probably more importantly, developing your selection program or all your testing and interviewing based on the job. So that's the thing we could talk about a bit more, but that's a perpetual challenge, I think, because it's such a big effort, right? So to have really excellent job analysis and job development is hard. It's especially among our clients and in our space, right? We service small and mid-sized organizations. They're running pretty lean, and it's difficult. So that's a big challenge. Other challenges would be, again, traditional, where biases still exist, conscious and unconscious. So perpetual challenge to kind of look deeply at those, examine them, recognize them, and work hard to mitigate them. And then we'll talk about this, I'm sure, the talent crunch we're seeing right now. And that's a funny one. There's a couple elements to that. Go too deep at this moment, but um, compensation is something that jumps out at. We've seen compensation inflation, just as we've seen inflation in general. And so what you get there is increased, I guess, reluctance to disclose salaries on the part of employers, right? So we see potentially fewer employers being willing to post salaries. It's always been a difficult issue. And that's that has an impact on equitable hiring. That sort of lack of transparency. That makes a difference. So those are some of the challenges we typically have been seeing.
Yeah, and that's very. They certainly sound like challenges, indeed. And so, Sue, from more of a general HR lens, where do some of these challenges fit? Do you see other challenges? Are there other things that come up often in terms of having diverse practices in your workplace?
So I think, yeah, absolutely. And I echo a lot of what Zach said. And I think one of the challenges employers face is they may think that, I need a diverse recruitment approach, or diverse approach to recruitment. So I'm going to make sure, I advertise in lots of different areas to attract the maximum candidate pool. I'm going to work to reduce, if not remove, bias from the selection process, taking all of that work and all of the training and unconscious bias. But then the work stops. Right? It's only the recruitment aspects, and it doesn't integrate into all the other workplace practices. And so you might be attracting a diverse group of candidates, but are you retaining them? Are they actually able to bring the value of diversity into your organization? And, yes, I'm not denying that there absolutely is compensation pressure at the moment, but that also is sometimes used as it can also be, I guess, mimic sort of other symptoms that, if you have I've seen organizations say, oh, we're losing employees because of our pay. Yes, it could be your pay, but it could also be something else. So I think employers are often quick to look at things like economic impacts, as opposed to, could it be more of a diversity and inclusion issue as well. And so really taking a holistic approach of what do we need to do to retain our employees, to engage our employees, to maximize the effectiveness of our employees and the ability of our employees to bring their whole selves to work and support our employees from a wellness perspective. But I think it's also a matter of saying, what do we believe, and what, as an organization, values do we want our employees to practice and our employees to embrace? And hopefully diversity is one of those. I mean, we'll get into more about the labor market in a bit, but it's a very tight labor market. So it doesn't make any sense to say, I'm going to further reduce my ability to attract in a tight labor market by having barriers in place or by ignoring certain segments of the population. It's, obviously it's wrong from a social perspective, but it's wrong from a business perspective. And, it's really about how do we have a holistic system to remove these inequalities from start to finish, which obviously starts with recruitment, but making sure that it's not just attracting diverse candidates, it's really about welcoming them and integrating them into the workplace.
Yeah, well said. And so both you and Zach alluded to this. There's a current unique situation happening in the job market where it's, as Zach phrased it, a frenzy, I believe. And so looking at that in the current realities that employers are really dealing with, what are some of the things you can actually do that should be part of your everyday activities that fit into this holistic diverse, holistic system that supports diversity. Sue, turn it back to you.
Well, and I realize I'm sort of leaning on a bit of a cultural lens here, but I think, the vast majority of cultures have a strong belief in welcoming people when they're in your home. And so I would suggest to most employers to really think about the recruitment process, the onboarding process, the integration process, and just generally how you treat employees, akin to how you treat somebody in your home. And what can you do to make people feel welcome? Think about, I know there are employers out there who have asked questions in interviews or in job postings, made comments that they would never dream of making to somebody sitting in their home. And so if you kind of use that as a benchmark to say, what can I do to make everybody feel welcome? What can I do to, help people? And obviously anybody going through an interview or a selection process is nervous, is uncomfortable. What can I do to help set them at ease? Stepping away from this, traditional and dated approach of, I need to make the interview as challenging and as, basically horrifying as possible to see how the person performs under pressure. Really what you're looking for is a candidate that interviews well, and a candidate that interviews well and can easily get another job is also a candidate who's very likely to leave you. So really focusing on what is it about the job that I want to understand about this candidate, and how can I best get that information from the candidate? So really looking at your recruitment process from what information am I trying to solicit? How can I best solicit that information? And one of the ways to do that is to set people at ease and make them comfortable and allow them to, highlight their amazing experience and talent, and by using examples that are relevant to them versus, forced examples, or, being a little bit more open-minded about the situations, not judging people simply by job titles or where they happen to have worked. Obviously that's a consideration, but it's only one data point. I'd really encourage employers to look deeper into not just what somebody's title may have been, but what were they doing in that role? What kind of experiences did they have? And particularly with that, taking it open-minded to the view of, if someone has very little or even no Canadian work experience, how much of their experience is transferable? Because it's actually much easier to close the gap between someone who has never been exposed to a Canadian workplace, getting them up to speed on how a Canadian workplace works, versus someone who has been exposed to a Canadian workplace that doesn't have years of experience, right? The years of experience takes years to get. If someone has experience, just hasn't been exposed to a Canadian environment, that's actually a much smaller gap to close. And just recognizing that that's not insurmountable. And more importantly, anyone who has experience in a different organization, particularly from a different country, has a different perspective. And, that's real value to your business in terms of assessing how you do work, looking at fresh ideas, and remaining competitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, Zach, if we look at the recruitment practice, do you have any opinions that vary on this topic, or any suggestions too? Sue was mentioning how to make people feel welcomed, and I feel like there's a lot that could happen there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. There's a ton of great points there. I'll jump on that one because that one's close to my heart. This idea that the old school thinking that the interview needs to be tough. It needs to be like, you're trying out to be a Navy SEAL or something like that, and that just being rigorous in itself is sort of is the end, or is sort of is what we're looking for. Advice to hiring teams is to do what you need to do to make a good decision. Okay, you don't need to go beyond that just to make it feel tough, because it makes you feel good. So be as rigorous as you need to be in your process, and to step back and get even more basic, really look at what that process is. So as Sue said, go to the job, right? Hopefully you have a really good job description, and even within that job description, examine how you've developed it. What is the language you're using? Are you being really concrete and clear and going directly to the job, or have you introduced sort of more vague language that is often represents constructs. So, you know, something like we see a catch-all bullet point in a job posting or a job description that says, you need 5 years of experience, period. And where's that from? I mean, how objective could that be? We'd prefer to see a focus on skills and abilities. Right? What do you really need to do to succeed in this job? Like, what is the job? What are the tasks? What's the mandate? And then translating that into the specifications. What skills and abilities does a person need in order to be good in this job? Right? And again, being very concrete about that, um, and carefully examining some of that muddy language that we sometimes get into. Some of these, call them traits or personal qualities. We look at things like, often we'll say we need someone who's ambitious and driven, or tenacious. And so, first thinking, is that true? Like, is that really part of the job? Do we need that? Or is that just a thing I like personally, and I'm the one who's writing this thing? Right? So, similar to me bias. And then further, to go deeper into that, those particular words and all kinds of different language is interpreted differently by different people. It can have even an exclusionary feel to it, right? So uh, we want qualified people to find our job, read it, and see themselves in it. Okay, so if I'm an individual who doesn't value or doesn't consider myself tenacious, right, that's a particular meaning in my mind, and not, I just don't think of it, then I won't necessarily see myself in that job, and so I've excluded, the writer of that job has excluded me from it, or from considering myself candidate. So, those are some of the, I guess, micro um, sort of techniques you can employ to really dive deep into what you're doing, looking at language specifically, and trying to get beyond your, call them your biases, or just your sort of your natural position and where you are. But at a sort of at a more systemic or structural level, stick to the job, understand the job, um, and design your posting around that, and then design your selection processes around that. So with your, the questions you ask in an interview, the different kinds of testing you might implement, um, really be focused on the job. So is, we've given a test and we've given the deadline as half an hour. Okay. Is that real? In the job, will you only have half an hour to do that task? Right? We were potentially excluding individuals from a neurodiverse background by introducing a sort of an arbitrary time limit. So looking deeply at those kind of things, um, that's the key to sort of laying the structural foundation, if you want to call it even a system or a systemic foundation, giving yourself the best chance to be equitable in hiring and hire workforce.
Yeah, yeah, great points. And I mean, micro pieces often do add up over time, and sometimes those micro things that you can do are sometimes easier changes to make than tackling, something that feels overwhelming. But earlier, Zach, you were alluding to some really excellent job analysis, and I believe you said descriptions were an important part of having good hiring practices, positive hiring practices. And so I was just wondering if all those suggestions you just made, if that kind of encompasses that, or if there was anything to add to really excellent job analysis then fuels more positive hiring practices.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's it. Like I would say, you can look at um, developing your EDI hiring program or developing your hiring program in general on sort of levels. So I think the job itself, understanding it, and then understanding the type of person, or the sort of the skill set of the person who will fill that job, understanding that well is really at the foundation. And then layer on top, all your techniques and strategies to, attract a diverse pool of individuals. Test for it and interview for it really well. Examine your biases. Be really intentional and conscious about that. But the job certainly is at the base of it. I think that's sort of HR 101. And that's not, it's difficult, but it's not new, and it's not, I don't want to take away from sort of HR skills. It's not rocket science, but it is some kind of science. But it's doable if you've got, solid HR people. So yeah, I think that is really the foundation. And I'll, invite Sue to comment on that more if she likes, because she's the expert on sort of job design.
Yeah, I fully agree with what you're saying, Zach. And I think to put it in a really simple way is really to think about it as, why am I including this? Like, ask yourself about every single thing you put in a job description. Why am I including this? Is it really necessary? Because I've seen job descriptions that are pages and pages of this and this and this and this and this and this, and like, you're not only looking for a unicorn, you're looking for a purple unicorn. Like, it's very few people have absolutely everything of that. Even people who have been amazing experts in the job probably don't have that. So think about, what are actually the core things I need, and maybe what are some other things I'd like to have, and recognize that an ideal candidate is going to have the essential items, but they're going to have a combination of the nice to haves, and that combination, how does it fit with the rest of the team? How does it fit with what else you're trying to do? And when I say that, I'm not saying like the other team, I'm saying not like the rest of the team. Where are they going to fill gaps? I can give a great example. I am not someone who would put attention to detail as their strength. I can do it when I have to. It is not something that comes naturally to me. I love hiring somebody to work with me who is absolutely focused on attention to detail, because I know that's a weakness of mine. So you really want to look at, how can I have somebody who balances out the rest of the team? How can I have someone who, brings a different perspective? And that obviously has a huge role for equity, diversity, inclusion, indigeneity, and really important, but also in a smaller sense of someone who has a different educational background, someone that has a different experience, someone who has more private sector, more public sector, more not-for-profit, more volunteer, whatever. All of those differences are really important too. So I think recognizing our biases and also our weaknesses of ourselves and our team, and looking to close those gaps, is a really effective way to hire. And if I could go off topic, because it kind of adds in, I'll take the question in the chat if that's okay with you guys. I love this about, how do we take equity into consideration when thinking about home assignments. I love that. Create a home assignment that really best replicates the type of work the person that would have to do. Zach gave a great example earlier of, if you're going to give somebody 30 minutes to do an assignment for a test for an interview, is that realistic, right? Are they actually only going to have 30 minutes in the real world? And so you either change the makeup of the assignment, or you change the assessment criteria, understanding that no one's going to be able to do this in 30 minutes. And exactly that. Like, if you're not client facing, this question goes on about, what if they're not in a client facing role? If someone's not client facing, how important are presentation skills? Right? Is that something that someone could later develop? If they're only going to be presenting internally, they don't need those skills day one. That's something that can be developed over time versus something they need to have right now. Sure, if you're looking for a hardcore external sales role, you probably want someone who has a lot of extrovert components to their personality. If you're not, it's irrelevant whether they're extrovert, introvert. Like, how you need a mix on your team. You need those different perspectives. Everyone brings a strength, and really looking at it as opposed to, if this person doesn't have this, it's a weakness. Instead, looking at what strengths does each candidate have, and what strengths would best help us be successful in filling this role that we're looking for. And why are we looking for those strengths? Why do they matter? And again, back to Zach's point of how does that then link to the job design and job analysis that you've already done?
Yeah, very, very, very solid overview. So just sort of switching a little bit here, I really believe that people most of the time really just want to do the right thing, but unintentionally They might be doing something that could be causing harm or hurting someone, and specifically with the recruitment practice, potentially using some of these outdated methods. You guys have also referenced bias a bunch of times. So are there any strategies that an employer can use to assess if their current hiring practices are inclusive, or maybe could use some updating? Zach, you want to go
Sure.
first?
Yeah. So, as we've been saying, look at your jobs, and then look at your job postings. Look at the language, um, and then look at where you're posting, right? So think of recruitment 101. You've got two major components. You're sourcing, in other words, you're developing a pool of candidates, and then you're selecting, right? You're going through your testing and interviewing and everything. So on your sourcing, you've looked at your job posting, you've tried to catch, language that is potentially vague, inaccurate, exclusionary. You've addressed that. And now look at how are you developing your pool of candidates. So you've got, you've got a few different, well, I'll say for now, three pillars to that sourcing strategy. You've got referrals, you've got your job posting or job advertising, right? You're putting the job out there. And then you have more direct reach out activities where you're searching for. So within each of those, you can examine what you're doing. So when you think of advertising your job, where are you putting it? Are you sticking just to these sort of niche job boards where you think your type of professional will come from? I think for many jobs those might be necessary avenues to explore, but certainly not sufficient avenues. So you want to go broader than that. Got your niche job boards, but go to other job boards too, mainstream job boards, and even go beyond that because not everybody's on LinkedIn, right? So think about how you can spread your job far and wide. Think about, just to be specific, we've partnered with agencies like this. There are employment services organizations in every city. They're funded by typically the provincial government, and they have access to talent such as newcomers to Canada, individuals with disabilities sometimes, who don't always know about or have access to some of these other job posting venues. And so partnering with organizations like that and any kind of advocacy organization who can tap into particular demographic communities, that's a great way to kind of expand your pool and kind of up your game when it comes to your sourcing activity. So just thinking, I don't know if it's thinking outside the box, but just thinking broader about that and how can we get our job out there. Um, I'll say one more thing on that. Referral program. This is not a tricky one, but I think it bears discussion. And I think particularly now, in this kind of talent crunched environment, employers are becoming desperate and sometimes they're running out of time and they need to hire and they fall back on, the same old technique where just get some referrals and who do you know? Who do you know? And, I we can't discount the value of referrals. It's an important pillar in the program. It is a way to get people into the pool, but it can't be the only way. And it can't, we don't want to place a kind of, undue emphasis on it or give it outsized importance. So just be careful about relying on referrals, right? Because, if you rely too heavily on that method, you're going to have the same looking and thinking workforce you've always had, right? Inevitably. So just a caution around that. Don't discount referrals, but just be thoughtful about it and understand the effects that over reliance on referrals can have.
Yeah, good points. And so I'll turn it over to you, Sue, with a little add-on of not just what you can do to sort of assess if you're potentially unintentionally maybe not having the most inclusive recruitment processes, but besides just assessing as an employer, what if you are the observer and you see it? Are there any good suggestions you have about bringing that up and having that discussion? Because I know sometimes people want to do the right thing, but might feel uncomfortable and just aren't sure how to, begin.
Absolutely. And I mean, it can be really hard. If you're in a room, and especially the person and the other person in the room is more senior to you, and you're conducting a recruitment process, and you see something that doesn't feel right. It is an important conversation to have, because it is for the best interest of the company and the organization. And I think where you'll realize that you see those things, I'd like to think that we're past the really horrific systemic racism and barriers that we had in place in recruitment systems. But I think there's still, as we've said, some unintentional biases that still exist. And I mean, one of them can be particularly around newcomers to Canada, right? Nothing wrong with asking the question, are you legally entitled to work in Canada? But when you start getting into questions around, well, what if your work permit doesn't get renewed? Or, are you going to apply for Canadian citizenship? Or are you a Canadian citizen? Like, is that relevant to your job? It can be an issue for security clearances, though I would suggest you leave the selection process and the security clearance process separate. But really, anything you're going to ask somebody is, why are you asking? And even taking a look at, some of the data that you can collect from assumptions, even around, the types of applicants you're getting. So if you post your job in all the regular places that you post your jobs, and you take a look and every single applicant has a name like John Smith, you're probably not reaching, a very diverse community. So you want to figure out, what else could I be doing to post this job in a more inclusive way? You also want to look at, if I am getting a lot of diverse candidates applying, are they making it through to selection, right? Because there's no point in having a whole bunch of wonderfully diverse candidates apply to roles if, obviously there's something in the selection process if nobody's ever making it through. We also want to look at, how have our forms become outdated and just, not unintentionally, but things that say things like, do you want someone to identify as, Mr. or Mrs., or, do they have to put their gender on an application? Why does it matter? Just things that we have always included out of habit, but they're not there out of necessity. So just remove that, so we don't have to ask somebody about, any of that information that is irrelevant, because it makes them uncomfortable, and they have to think, how do I want to answer this question? Do I want to be honest and have the conversation up front, or do I just want to remain silent and go into surface acting to try to get the job? And I think, sort of along the same lines, it's great to have that willingness to accommodate statement on a job posting, but I think I would go one further and invite candidates to say, hey, we're inviting you for an interview, a selection process, etc. Is there anything that I can do to better assist you through this process? And so not just, say that you will accommodate if somebody asks, but maybe proactively ask a person if there's anything that they need to be more comfortable or more successful, to really target those, neurodiverse candidates or other candidates that may just have an administrative barrier that has nothing to do with job performance.
Very good point. And there was one thing I was curious about that was mentioned actually close to the beginning of today's session, was right now we're in a hiring frenzy. The market is very hot. And Zach, you mentioned about positive compensation practices. And I'm sure right now that that's a tricky area. So I was curious Sue, if you want to start, what employers can do to have really inclusive compensation practices at a very high level. I know this is never an easy conversation, but if you just have some suggestions, I think that'd be awesome.
Sure. And I mean, I think this is one of those cases where there's no right answer. Personally, I am an advocate of stating the expected salary for a job, not just a band, but the expected salary. Because, research has shown that whenever there is a band or salaries are subject to negotiations, it's actually the BIPOC community and particularly the female BIPOC community that is hit hardest, and they end up faring the worst in those circumstances. So compensation has actually become a barrier and if you negotiate less effectively than, someone else, you're getting paid less for that first entry point into the company, chances are, 5-10 years later, you're still being paid less. So another thing companies can do if they're not comfortable with that transparency is to take on the burden of self-correction. So if you hire two candidates into the job, maybe 2 years apart, and the first candidate negotiated a salary of X, and a new candidate comes in 2 years later and negotiates a higher salary, automatically move that other person up to the same salary or higher because they've been there longer. Proactively correct salaries and don't just let that discrepancy sit in place because somebody's been a more effective negotiator or someone had a different market that they were able to negotiate differently. Because it's, looking at it from the end process, you're going to regret losing a really high performer over, the sake of a couple $1,000s if they were to find out that, and somebody who is just hired is making more than them with less experience. And when I say lose a person, yes, they may depart your organization, or they may sort of slip into more of a presenteeism or, different work ethic of, what, if this is how you're going to treat me, this is the level of work that I'm going to be performing. So we always want to be trying to get the best out of our employees, and being inclusive and supportive in our compensation practices is the best way to do that.
Agree. And your point too made me think that let's say someone did actually choose to physically leave, there's a whole additional cost associated with hiring someone brand new, right? That has its own impacts, and I'm sure is probably larger than the difference if you had just self-corrected. Zach, did you have any perspectives to add?
No, I think Sue captured it all. The pay disparity is traditionally, it comes from it's born of this sort of lack of transparency around pay, and so getting pay onto job postings, being clear and transparent about it is kind of a foundational step to being the type of employer that is truly living those EDI principles.
Which is hopefully the end goal for everyone, of living the principles. And so we have a question here, and Zach, I'll send it over to you first. Are there any diversity-focused job platforms to help capture candidates, maybe a professional online network type thing, and this to get away from the influx of those only one type of person, Johnny Smith in this example?
For job boards, there probably are a lot. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in sort of we've seen this for the past few years within recruitment, is that, like in every industry almost, monopolization kind of grows over time, right? So what we've seen for job boards, and we can see a job board as a platform, or we think of platforms as other things, I suppose, but job boards have become really job aggregators. So got LinkedIn, Indeed, Google, and that's kind of it. So those are the big boys or big players in this space, and they kind of gobble up jobs from everywhere, and that becomes where people look. So, I think it's wise to investigate whether there could be job boards or groups that provide better access to a range of demographic groups. As for hiring tools, the key recruitment tool that we have or think about is a software called an ATS, an applicant tracking system. So many organizations use these. If you're above a certain size, it really simply makes sense. If you're hiring even just a few times a year, it makes sense because it really increases the efficiency of your process. And so, specifically for applicant tracking systems, I don't know of one that is sort of keyed in on, being an EDI system, but there are a lot of, or a number of sort of, call them modules or tools that you can tack onto your ATS. So there are tools that you can add to your ATS that give you, there's a cost to it, but it will give you the ability to anonymize resumes, for example. So, scrub the resume of identifying information, primarily a name. So yeah, you can access things like that. Typically, you would have an existing ATS, and then that ATS would have some integration or some partnerships with other sort of more precise kinds of software that do these specific things, such as scrub names, or potentially even, if you're creative with your ATS, you can, instead of relying on resumes, you can create forms or questionnaires where you're soliciting very specific information from people, and when that comes to you, it will come to you in kind of a bit of a bland but consistent format. So you could look at your 20 applicants' questionnaires, all looks the same. We're not focused on formatting, colors do we like, or what fonts. It gives us an opportunity to eliminate all of those funny little biases that infect our thinking. And you can add a bit of that sort of uniformity and consistency to the process that way. So if you can think about things creatively, often you can do it with the tools you have, and then there are other tools out there you can tack on as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't know, Sue, if you had any varying experience on this.
I agree with Zach in terms of, definitely the big players are a great place to post jobs, but there are also usually, depending on what community you're working in, or if it's a in-person job, you're probably going to want local community as well. But also reach out to places, some of the employment services Ontario offices are a great resource. Just people who are struggling for whatever reason in finding employment. It has nothing to do with their job performance. It's normally things of like, I've come here for advice on how to write a cover letter, how to write a resume, or how to highlight my experience. Making sure you're tapping into those places. A lot of First Nations actually have specific employment offices, catering to usually that's set up by their band leadership to really help members of their community, targeting jobs in those areas. If you are recruiting students, obviously the main career center, but don't be afraid to reach out to some of the student associations as well, because it really sends the message of, we're inclusive, and we want to welcome candidates from all backgrounds, versus, we only want a particular type of candidate. Sometimes there is that assumption about employers. It's unfair. But sometimes a lot of candidates might be uncertain or uncomfortable in applying. So anything that you can do to sort of just show that you're inclusive, those, equity, diversity, and inclusion statements are great on job postings, but I think try not to make them too forced is the only word that comes to mind, right? Where it's like, okay, that is clearly something that has been run through, 3 lawyers or taken right out of the legislation. Like, make it, hey, you know what? We welcome everyone. We encourage, everyone to apply. Like, really just using simple language that gets your message across, versus, making sure that there's at least, 9 or 10, 12 letter words in there. Can really make a big difference. Is think about the wording that you're using, the messaging in your job posting, and how can you make that wording more inclusive.
Okay, great. And then any final thoughts, Sue, to share on what employers can do to help create a positive, inclusive workplace? And then we'll open up to questions after.
Sure. I think, really be open to listening to feedback. From employees, collect feedback on the recruitment process. What could we do better? It's that constant improvement that will really help elevate you to an excellent employer. It's fantastic to already be, really good and really proud of what you're doing, but to recognize that it never stops. It's a continuum, but we always want to be better. We want to be better next year than we were this year. How can we continue to grow? How can we remove even more barriers? How can we be even more inclusive, even more people focused, and just continuing that assessment? And another thing specific to recruitment that can help with that is, yes, you want to ask all candidates the same questions and have them go through the same process, but recognize too that candidates have different experience. So for example, if you were to ask Zach and I the same question about, a time where we were, faced a leadership challenge, we're each going to give you a different example. So you want to be able to have a dialogue with each of us about our example without fear of, oh, but I asked Sue a different question than I asked Zach. It's not that you asked us a different question. It's that you explored further the examples that we gave and kind of tailored the conversation to us as individuals while still assessing the same uniform criteria.
Yes, good suggestion. And Zach, is there any takeaway that you'd like to leave the group with? Any final words?
No, I think I'll just briefly echo kind of what we've said, and think about your jobs, your selection process. Think about things like really strong fluency in English. How important is it? Right? This is one of those old cliches or stereotypes. Without thinking, we throw it into a job posting, or we just assume it's important. Think about that stuff. There are ways to communicate really clearly without being a perfect speaker of English. And it's the same old barriers that have existed for a long time for people. And so my advice is to really think about that stuff. Think about how you write your postings. Think about what you really need in a person to succeed in this job, whatever your opening is.
Yeah, great point. And so I'll just give a shout out if there's any final questions people want to share in the Q&A. You're welcome to do so now. The time has flown by. We're almost at the hour mark. And so if there are any questions that maybe you just didn't want to ask today or didn't have time to, or you just need to stew on them and then you would like some follow-up, you're welcome to reach out to any of us on LinkedIn. You can find us by our names, or likewise, you can also reach out to info@businessrivergroup.com and then we can get in touch with you that way. But otherwise, thank you everyone so much for joining. Thank you, Welch, for hosting and organizing. It's been a pleasure, and I will say bye-bye, and thank you for joining. And thank you, Sue and Zach, for sharing your expertise.